Hello, everybody. It's good to meet with you this morning. We're just going to allow a minute or so for others to join us, and then we'll get started.
Hello, everyone. I'm reporting from windy Yorkshire. I do feel a little bit like doing a weather report, Elaine. I don't know about you, but my garden furniture went flying this morning.
I know we had windows that just shot open, and yeah, really heavy rain. Yeah,
Mhm. Yes.
another storm, almost at the end of January, though.
Yeah, almost.
Right, so we've got a good number of participants now. I think we're just short of 150, which is lovely. And I think, given that it's 1 minute past 11, we will make a start.
Yes, great.
Yeah, good. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Elaine Richardson, and I'm joined by Kerry Lawler. We're delighted to be here for Family Mediation Week to talk about something we believe is increasingly vital to our work, trauma-informed mediation. So, over the next 50 minutes, we're going to explore what trauma is, why it matters in mediation, and most importantly, what we can do practically to create safer, more effective processes for our mediation participants. Next slide, please.
It's good to be your assistant, Elaine, today with
Yes, Kerry's on the slides.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's great to be with you. As Elena said, my name's Kerry Lawler. I'm a psychotherapist, a family law supervisor, a coach, and a trainer. And over the many years in which I've practiced as a psychotherapist, I've done extensive training in trauma therapy. So I'm pleased to be able to bring my contribution this morning to a kind of insight into what trauma looks like in mediation space. Indeed, I'll be sharing my own experience of trauma going through a mediation process personally, but also working with individuals that are expressing some traumatic distress. So I'm pleased to be able to be with you this morning.
Thanks, Kerry. And I'm Elaine Richardson. I run my own online mediation practice, working with families across the UK and beyond. I'm a solicitor, collaborative practitioner, and accredited child inclusive hybrid mediator. In addition to my practice, I support the profession as a professional practice consultant, PPC, for mediators, and also as a family law supervisor for lawyers. I'm a trainer and I train lawyers and mediators in domestic abuse, safeguarding, and high conflict for resolution. And I'm a Scottish Law Society certified trauma informed lawyer. That's where I did my training, and I'm co chair of the National Dispute Resolution Committee for Resolution. So, after those introductions,
Very impressive, Elaine. Very impressive list. You don't like
thank you
to
so
say
much.
it.
Thank you so much. Um, we know that many of you have worked with a participant who seemed to shut down mid-session or suddenly become very emotional without obvious reason.
Mm.
That's often trauma at work. And the good news is there are practical strategies that we can use to help. So, next slide, please, Kerry.
And this is me, isn't it? I get to talk about trauma. And I guess trying to make this succinct into a couple of slides isn't very easy. I could spend all day talking to you about how does trauma show up for us. But I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible and articulate some of the kind of diagnostic criteria around trauma. But trauma is common law language now, isn't it? My daughter finished her driving test and said she had PTSD. Um, in fact, after this, I'm probably going to say, good Lord, that was traumatic experience speaking in front of all of those. It's common language that we use. But what is it? And how do we define it? And how does it show up? Um, Look, I think I'd like to describe us as being very, very sophisticated threat detection devices. Because what we're actually talking about is if we trade out the word trauma and we replace it with threat, it helps us really understand why, as a Homo sapien, we have a response to a threat. We are threat detecting devices. very sophisticated ones with extremely advanced technology in our brain that means that we can respond to threat very, very quickly. In fact, I can smell toast burning from 3 rooms away. That's my smell threat sense. If I let off a large bang behind you, you would all jump. You would jump out of our skin. I was thinking about what a funny saying that was earlier on. Um, and our brain is obsessed with scanning for threat and scanning for threat and looking for patterns. So it's an extremely physiological response in our body. And so, actually, if we break it down like that, that trauma is a threat response, I can't imagine that you work with a single individual, if they're human, that doesn't come with some level of threat in their system. Even perhaps the process of turning up in mediation office means that they are already in a threat state. Could we say that? This is what we know. We know that the stimuli for the threat response is variable. We know that some people would be terrified of a spider, for example. Certainly, I would jump out of my skin, to use that phrase again, if I saw a big black spider running up the wall behind the screen here now. But we also know that some people will have been exposed to very serious stimuli, and the discrepancy between what people experience as a traumatic event is hugely varied. And that's important because it's very easy to dismiss or diminish someone's experience of what we would say was traumatic by judging what level that the stimuli was to us. And also, individuals have very personal responses to that stimuli. As I've described, as many of the people that are on this screen would have a very, very different response to a trauma event. And so we've started to recognize that we can't define trauma by the event. How we define trauma is how an individual responds to it. And that takes into account all the variability. We know, for example, that two individuals that survived the London bomb attack, one of them wasn't able to leave the house for a year, and the other, the next morning, jumped out of bed and said, "Life is for living. I'm going to jack in my career and go and do the thing I love." People have extremely different reactions to the same stimuli. And I think that's important for us to recognize. We're not all the same. In fact, I think it would be fair to say that we all have post-traumatic symptoms. Like I said, I certainly will be needing a hot cup of sweet tea after I finish this morning. And we all experience post-traumatic symptoms to a lesser or greater extent. Our brain loves to pattern recognize, and it loves to store negative experiences, and it loves to then predict that bad things are going to happen again. So we absolutely recognize that individuals will be coming to us perhaps with some traumatic or some threat responses from previous events that might not necessarily ever categorize by psychologists as PTSD, a diagnostic term that we use. Let's just think about that for a second. Psychologists group in the DSM-5 and the ICD-11 post-traumatic stress disorder as being a cluster of symptoms that include things like flashbacks and avoidance, relational difficulties. And they cluster them together and then say this person has a diagnosis of PTSD. But actually, I would suggest to you that very few of the individuals that come to mediation would actually have a diagnosis of PTSD. And if they did, you probably would know about it. Many are likely to come with having had complex trauma, for example, a term that's used in the ICD-11 and not in our DSM-5, but I think probably will be in the next publication. Complex trauma being about relational, historical, child experiences. But what I want to sort of tease out when we talk about what is trauma is individuals will come perhaps with a PTSD diagnosis or perhaps with a complex trauma diagnosis, And they might be significant, but I would also suggest that probably almost everyone that is coming to you will have some sort of threat response or some sort of post-traumatic symptoms. And that's the territory that you guys probably find yourself swimming in. Why does this matter for mediation? I think it matters quite significantly, actually. I know that unaddressed trauma, so people coming in either with the diagnosed PTSD or complex PTSD or just post-traumatic symptoms, there's a good chance that it will block their ability to communicate and be cognitive in their decision making. That's partly because when the amygdala fires off the adrenaline and the cortisol to get you into fight flight to be kind of running, it turns off the prefrontal cortex so that you actually don't think. It was kind of there to stop you being able to decide whether or not you run or whether you just run. The answer is you just run. But the result is that you are not able to think clearly. And I think you probably see quite a lot of that. Obviously, if an individual is dysregulated and they are unable to kind of regulate themselves emotionally or mentally, then it can massively escalate conflict. And you can find yourself in a situation where two people go to war in a room, and that itself can be distressing for both parties and for you as the mediator. And of course, the mediation process itself, especially if you're asking people to talk about historical trauma events or events that have happened in the course of their marriage, can be re traumatizing if they're not handled sensitively. And so, a trauma aware approach helps to create some safety, helps to create some kind of pause in the kind of distressing process of mediation that enables both individuals who are both probably in a threat state to be able to approach this process in a way that is meaningful and beneficial. I'll just move on quickly to throw in the adverse childhood experiences. And really, that speaks to what I was talking about, the complex trauma. I've kind of skipped ahead of myself a little bit. Adverse childhood experiences was a study that was done in 1998, an extensive study with 17,000 odd adults. And what they discovered was that there were some very significant events that happened in individuals' lives that might otherwise not have been classified as trauma. PTSD, in actual fact, its classification is either near death or threat to death or threat to violence or sexual violence. But there are tons of other reasons why somebody can experience a traumatic event in childhood. Things like neglect, things like witnessing unwell parents. There's a kind of big list of defined characteristics for ACEs, disrupted neurodevelopment. The list is there in front of us. Disease, disability, all of those factors can play into people developing what we call our ACEs. 40%, in fact, reported two or more. And the prediction tells us that the more childhood, adverse childhood experiences that an individual has in their childhood, the more likely they are to turn up in their adulthood and present as emotional dysregulation, relational issues, parental conflict, substance use, abuse. So it's really important that we understand that ACEs in our client's history are likely to have an impact in how they show up and turn up in your mediation room. And it's important for you to be able to kind of be aware of that. You will see them, and they allow us, I guess, with insight into understanding someone's history. Remember, their patternings of threat means that we'll be able to predict possibly how they're going to behave when they have traumatic experiences in this process. Let me move on to the next slide, which is recognizing trauma in the room. I think some of you will, without question, have experienced this happening. I certainly have, actually, even this morning in my private practice here. Um, what does it look like when it shows up in the room? And you know, how long is a piece of string? We've got lots of different directions that this can go because people, as I've described, respond differently. But one of the ones that I think I see quite often is what we call disassociation. So a kind of sense of them kind of disappearing. So they're physically present, obviously, but actually they're kind of not really there. They stare blankly, they don't respond to questions, they have gaps in their memory. And actually, sometimes that can feel kind of a little uncomfortable when you recognize that somebody is kind of not very present with you. And that can have some degree, there's a sort of spectrum even within that. Sometimes people can quite literally shut down, and you notice that their eyes are darting and they become very, very agitated and fidgety. Sometimes people literally look actually almost totally still and silent. If we go back to the threat response, we've got fight, flight, freeze, and freeze looks like disassociation. Um, and it can be a bit disconcerting. But also to say that sometimes people actually remember with the prefrontal cortex turns off, they're really struggling to track what you're saying. So they're struggling to kind of process cognitively. Their executive functions diminished quite significantly. So actually, whereas they might be able to read spreadsheets normally, perhaps in this state, under pressure in a setting like this, they might really, really struggle to make sense of it. As one of my colleagues once said, we weren't meant to be reading spreadsheets when we were running from a burning building. And the idea of that kind of threat response when, you know, when everything's up in the air and we are really, really acutely stressed, it's unlikely that we'll be in a good place to be able to be cognitive. We also see, and you'll have seen this, I'm quite sure, emotional overwhelm. So sometimes floods of tears, sometimes actually even kind of rage attacks, so very kind of abusive and hostile energy, sometimes lots and lots of protesting and raised voices, and sometimes panic attacks. I certainly have had several situations, even as a working psychotherapist, where someone's had quite a significant panic attack. And actually, when someone's breath changes, it shortens, and then their brain starts to think that they are actually not breathing properly. It can just exacerbate it. So, panic attacks are something that we can often see in practice. They might not necessarily be connected to what's been said. Certainly, when I was going through my divorce process, I never had panic attacks before, but did have them during this process. Um, and then I just move on to the difficulty making decisions, which I've probably already elaborated on. This idea that actually simple choices can feel impossible. I can remember feeling very much like I was in a fog, that actually I couldn't make sense. There was a kind of decision paralysis, and I was very much seeking other people to kind of tell me what to do because I couldn't kind of think clearly. And that was compounded, I think, and I know we're going to come on to talk about that, but it was compounded also by sleeplessness. So that meant that sort of dysregulated sleep meant that actually it was very difficult to make decisions, and maybe that kind of feeds into people's trauma response. Also, the hypervigilance, we see that always in a threat response, naturally, a kind of heightened paranoia, constantly scanning for threat. They might be very, very suspicious. They might be very, very defensive. They might actually be very, very scared. And of course, they might have good reason to be, but this hypervigilance and this hyper checking behavior might show up either in the room or in your correspondence with them. And then, of course, physical responses, some of which I will have already mentioned: rapid breathing, trembling, often trembling, muscle tension. I remember I would always feel as if I was really, really, really shaky immediately after a meeting. So it's interesting to kind of notice how people have physical responses. And I guess your job isn't as mediators to begin to kind of diagnose that this might be a trauma response. But again, if you just switch out the word trauma and you go, this is a threat response, it's easy for you to be able to say, yes, this individual is certainly under a great deal of threat. And it's something that we need to kind of pause and take account of in our work. Yeah, my next point actually is to just again explain that when we're talking about trauma and we're talking about threat, we're talking about the nervous system response. So trauma impacts how um, a very biological trigger of our nervous system. So when we can be kind of created and contained within a safe environment, it calms our nervous system and allows us to be able to come back to homeostasis and a more base level for clearer thinking. And the opportunity for that does sit with you. There are ways in which, and we're going to talk about them, you can improve creating the safe containment for your clients. But of course, there is the risk that any kind of threat cues, so any hint of shame, any hint of your disappointment or frustration can actually increase an individual's dysregulation. And I think sometimes I see this in settings in couples therapy where quite often individuals come out of couples therapy feeling as if the family therapist or the psychotherapist has supported one individual. It's really, really important that we try and keep the space, contain the space to be safe for both parties. Otherwise, we're going to heighten the dysregulation and the protective armoring of the individuals that are in it. Um, I think actually I'm moving on to you now, Elaine. Is that all right if I switch over to
Thanks,
you?
Kerry. So, um, we're looking at core principles now. So we've got some on this slide and some on the next slide. And you'll see that trauma-informed practice rests on 6 core principles. So looking at the first group, safety is the foundation. This isn't just being physical safety, although obviously that matters. It's emotional safety, and it's the experience of being respected as opposed to being judged, and being able to be vulnerable. It's psychological safety, knowing that the process is designed to protect you, not to harm you. Excuse me. Which, of course, is particularly important given what Carrie has just said. Transparency means explaining what's happening, why, and what comes next. No surprises. Again, that could be perceived as a threat. No jargon, easily understandable language. When people understand the process, the unknown threat reduces. That's why transparency is so important. And I think about the language project and how much is being done within family law to make it easier for people to understand. So moving on to choice, that means agency and autonomy, offering options, saying we could do this or we could try that. What feels right to you? Because when people have control, the nervous system settles. Over to you, Kerry, for the next 3.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I come back to this core principle of your stance, actually, because I think you have a very significant opportunity to create this containment, as I've said, to create a tone, to create a structure, to create a presence. Therapeutically, we sometimes describe that therapists bring 50% of the energy into the room, and actually we lend our safety and our stability to our clients. And I think that's actually a principle that you could begin to adopt, because if you are stable and safe and feeling contained and feeling kind of well and solid and safe, then you're able to offer that to your clients in a really significant, energetic way. But the core principles here, I think, set out that empathic listening being absolutely fundamental. And I'd suggest to you that you consider that you take the stance of a scientist. Now, I'm nicking this from Adam Grant, his fantastic book, Think Again, where he talks about taking a different stance with a scientist's mind, as opposed to being the preacher, which is kind of spouting ideas, the prosecutor that is trying to see flaws in reasoning, not the politician that's trying to persuade in some way, all of which those of you with a kind of legal background might well be bringing in to the space, but instead to take the stance of the scientist. The scientist comes with curiosity. The scientist comes by wanting to see what's there, to kind of move towards the truth, to kind of test assumptions, and to take a position of being kind of open-minded to what's there. So when I talk about you coming with empathic stance so that you can empathically listen, I want you to see that as opening the door to curiosity. What's here? What am I hearing, and what am I hearing behind what I'm hearing? And that's the idea of you searching for the emotions, and even maybe listening to threat language, listening to historical threat experiences, observing patterns of behavior, because there's way more going on than just what is coming out of the mouth. But empathic listening is a very powerful skill. It's a mindset, which is why I'm talking about creating that scientist mind, the curious mind, and a skill set in terms of how you handle dialogue. And I know it. Pretty much everyone on here will be skilled at that, but I do want you to use that as a very core principle when you're working with trauma, because we have this risk of being able to be shaming and re-traumatizing if we don't actually kind of interrogate and just, I don't actually mean the word interrogate, I mean if we don't kind of dig into trying to seek to understand what is actually happening in this person's life and story. Um, Again, the collaboration. So the idea that you guys are working with them, you are alongside. It's not power over, it's power with. And actually, you're not imposing. You're certainly not the preacher giving some idea of some ideals. You are working together collaboratively. I know all of you will be into that idea anyway, if you find yourself in this space even today. And again, flexibility. This is so important because actually, when we're talking about creating safety, sometimes we just have to give that tons and tons of spaciousness because everybody's nervous system works differently. And because of the way that people respond, sometimes people can recover quite quickly from a difficult dialogue or a difficult exchange. Sometimes it might only take them a couple of minutes to kind of regroup, take a breath. But sometimes it can take longer. In fact, sometimes it can be so derailing that they actually need to take a break. Maybe they need to leave the room or they need to turn their screen off, go away, come back a couple of minutes later. I think we have to create lots of flex in the system to be able to process as needed, alongside and collaboratively with the individuals that we're working with. Elaine, I don't know how we're doing for time, so I'm just gonna just over to you now.
It's fine. We're absolutely fine, Kerry.
Good, good.
Thanks very much. So let's look at some practical strategies. And I wanted to speak a bit about pre-mediation first. Um, so we need to think about how it all shows up in real mediation work. And I'd say that the individual confidential pre-mediation meeting is critical. This is often where we set the tone for the entire process. And I always think of it as a golden opportunity, not just an assessment and information meeting, which of course it is, but it's such a big opportunity to find out if you think there's some trauma going on and how you can address it. So we do that by firstly building rapport. So that's listening to the person's experience. And that listening is not to judge, but it's to understand their perspective, their concerns, their history. What are they worried about? What past experiences might be activated by coming to mediation? Because that is almost bound to happen. Secondly, we explain the process. And again, using that clear language, we do it clearly and collaboratively. So you might say, here's how mediation works. We'll have some time together and I'll help you. You're always in control. You can pause, ask for a break, or step back if you need to. And I say to participants right at the beginning that I'm concerned about their safety and their well-being. So please ask for a break if needed. Third point on this slide is to address concerns directly. So if one participant is anxious about seeing the other, we speak about that. What would help you to feel safer is a good question. Maybe that's a separate room. Maybe it's ground rules. Maybe it's a particular seating arrangement in the room. But find out about that. Ask about concerns. Fourth point, we set ground rules together. So these are not imposed, but again, collaborative. What do you need to feel respected in this process? What would help you? This gives the participant agency and it often clarifies what they need to feel safe, which is important for you to know. So I'd say that pre-mediation isn't a tick box, it's a foundation and it's safety work and it changes everything that comes after that. So speaking of what comes after, Kerry, can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So let's look at practical strategies. And the first thing is information giving. So this is how we give information. Now, as Kerry said, a dysregulated person's brain is not processing complex detail well. Their working memory is compromised. So how we communicate matters enormously. So first of all, going back to that language point, use plain language. So let me give you an example. Instead of saying in a very lawyerish way, we need to consider the legal framework for spousal maintenance, you might try something like, let's talk about how you might both support yourselves going forward. Next point is to check understanding. Don't assume understanding, because very often that doesn't happen. I think it was Winston Churchill who said that the greatest difficulty with communication is knowing that it's taken place. So ask if it makes sense to them. Keep reassuring the participants to ask you questions. So I say to people, no question is a daft question. Invite them in. I reflect back what I have heard, and I gently ask the participant, what did you hear me say, to check their understanding? And that's a really good question because very often it really doesn't match with what you said. And you then have the opportunity to clarify that again. Pace the information, don't dump everything at once. Give key points, pause, check in, offer breaks, as we've said. Always give that one next step to take away from the meeting, both for you and for them. So I will often conclude a meeting by saying, my next step is X, your next step is this. So at least they've got that one important thing that they know that each of you is doing. Provide written summaries. Of course, we do this. A handout or email summary afterwards reduces cognitive load. That's why you're doing it. Of course, if you're having a pre-mediation meeting, you may never meet that person again because mediation may not take place. So to have a handout afterwards that they can refer to is really, really helpful. And it helps them really in whatever process they decide to use moving forward to address things. So it's giving that person an opportunity to review it later, and that might be at a point when they're more regulated. So it also prevents misunderstanding. So again, that if there is misunderstanding, potentially that could be a threat. So it's important that you manage that. And then repeat key points. A repetition in a calm way helps information land. And I always remember attending a family mediation week presentation a few years ago now by Emma Heptonstall. And the thing I took away from it, the most important thing I took away from it, is that important information is always worth repeating. It always bears repeating. So thanks for that, Emma. These are small shifts, but they can transform how clients experience and retain information. They signal that we understand their capacity and that we're working with them, not against them. So let's move on to the next practical strategy, which is managing stress. Next slide, please.
That's me, I think.
It is you.
Jumping back in to talk about what to do in the event of a client actually becoming distressed, either kind of physically present with you in the room or online. I think this is a tricky one because, how long, again, is a piece of string? I can't possibly speak to every single scenario. But I think it's important for me to give you some tips and techniques for what to do when you notice that somebody is really, really, really very upset or in fact having perhaps a panic attack or disassociating. And some of them will be applied across all. So use it as you will. I guess the first point is to recognize the early signs. For me, I would always be scanning, always be tracking and scanning for body language. So I would be noticing shifts in someone's expressions on their face. Often you will notice eyes filling, you will notice chins quivering, you will notice the change in their complexion. You might even notice that their breath begins to shorten, or you will begin to notice their voice starts to constrict because cortisol is a constrictor. Actually, usually you can also notice kind of the kind of concaving, the turning inwards. If you are skilled, you'll actually be able to spot that really, really quite early on, just like many of us can probably do with our children. You can see the flash in their eyes and you know that they're actually really, really very upset. So again, become an expert tracker. I went to a trauma conference in Oxford last September and I listened to a whole hour and a half session on tracking. So tracking people's gestures, tracking people's movements, tracking people's shifts in their chair, tracking body language is actually incredibly, there's so much intel in there. And if you're able to get in there early and notice the early signs, then you'll be able to move quickly onto the second point, which is to offer them choices. So actually, I would always use language of, I'm noticing. I'm noticing this is difficult for you. What do you need? And actually, sometimes people go, I don't really know what I need. And then you can offer, how about we take a break? Would you like a drink of water? Could we just pause for a second or two? We can come back to this later. If they can see that you are calm and that you are seeing and knowing and observing, in parenting, we call it attunement. If they can see that you are attuned and you offer them, I'm noticing the tears rolling down your face. We're just going to pause for a second. It's incredibly powerful. And actually, sometimes just those 2 points alone will mean that you're kind of there. But again, and Elaine said this, and I have too, think about pace. Slow everything down. Remember, if you slow your breath down, if you slow your speech down, if you slow your pace down, sometimes that can literally mean like just putting papers aside, just really kind of demonstratively going, shuffling forward in your chair, maybe. It's just going to take a minute. Let's just slow things down. I see that this is difficult for you. Again, think about the energy that you bring. I know that you've got time and task, and that's compressed. And so oftentimes there's a kind of need for you to get to a certain point. But if you could, and I guess that's the luxury of therapy, we don't have that. Sorry, guys, you should switch profession. But the idea of creating the space and the time to be able to contain safely, to bring calm to their nervous system. Actually, one of the techniques I often use is to ask them, if possible, to look me in the eye, especially if they're disassociating. When a human gazes at another human in the eye, it actually quite quickly regulates their nervous system. I also have all kinds of kind of things in here, including weighted blankets, a yoga sandbag that I can put on people's feet. I have kind of fidget toys and things to squeeze. Again, ways of just regulating the nervous system through movement. Fourth point is to validate emotion. Remember what I was saying about the kind of curiosity, sort of being open to listening to every single transaction that is offered to you that expresses emotion, seeing if you can validate that. Quite often, I will say, that makes perfect sense to me. I get it. I understand that this matters to you. I can see that you're grieving. That's okay. So we don't try and kind of move them on quickly. We don't minimize it. We don't try and kind of fix it and say, oh, you'll be fine. You'll be fine in a few years' time. We stay in the present moment. In therapy, we call it staying in their frame of reference. So you stay in the emotion that you either hear or that you see. And then again, grounding them into the present moment. There's been occasions where I've had people having panic attacks, and I will ask them when we kind of bring the breath back round to look around the room and tell me 5 things that they can see. So a lamp, a clock, a fan, a book. Then to give me 5 things that they can hear, or 5 things that they can smell, or 5 things that they can touch. So again, we're asking them to kind of pull back into their prefrontal cortex, into their thinking brain in a way that will help them to down regulate. And again, I say again, your presence, you are lending yourself energy, of kind of technical word that we use in therapy. You are lending your presence and your safety. So if you stay calm, if you stay non-judgmental, you can show that you can kind of contain their distress, that the distress that they're sharing with you is information that will help them be processed. Then it is incredibly gifting to the mediation process. Hopefully, there's some things in there that are helpful, and I'm looking at the clock and thinking, I'm talking too much, Elaine. I'm sorry. I went a little bit off script there,
Please
didn't
don't apologize. It's absolutely amazing, invaluable stuff, Kerry.
I? Okay,
Uh,
next. I think this is you.
it is me, yes.
Okay.
So you might be thinking, this sounds like more work. It does sound like a lot, doesn't it? But it's not. It's actually different work, and it's more effective work when you practice trauma-informed mediation. Um, you understand client behavior. That participant who's being stubborn might be terrified. That's transformative. You shift from judgment to understanding. You gain confidence. Instead of feeling out of your depth when emotion arises, you have a framework. You know what's happening and you know what to do. You actually build stronger relationships because participants feel seen, as Kerry's been saying, and that builds trust, which is the currency of effective mediation. You achieve better outcomes. Acceptable proposals reached when both participants are regulated, safe, and engaged are far more sustainable. They're likely to be honoured and less likely to be changed. Next slide, please.
Yeah, this is our case vignette, isn't it? Now, I'm sure that will be people listening that have got cases and clients that they'd love to talk about, and maybe Elaine, you can see if there's some questions that are coming in that we can take at the end. We want to kind of create enough time to do that. But look, here's an example of an individual. I'm sure this will be a familiar story. A couple come into mediation. They're there to talk about their children and their finances after separation. And in that session, the dad says that he wants to have more time with the children. And the mother completely freaks out, totally overreacts, or at least on the face of it, and is kind of flooded with rage. And you kind of suddenly realize you've got quite a kind of serious situation happening in front of you. She stands up, she shouts, you don't even know them, you were never there, and kind of threatens to leave. Now, with trauma awareness, you might understand Without trauma awareness, let me start with that. Without trauma awareness, you might think, dear Lord above, what just happened? You might start to feel really, really uncomfortable. You might even start to say, look, it's absolutely acceptable that let's look at the research on children's well-being and shared parenting and sort of kind of try and throw in the kind of data and the facts. You might even get a bit cross yourself and react from your own stuff, which is, it's unacceptable shouting in my room. I won't have it. And then suddenly the mum feels like she's been completely shamed and dismissed, and she shuts down, and the whole process just goes to pot. Now, what might happen if you approach that scene with some trauma awareness? And I'm not saying that these are easy. I mean, really, really not easy. You might have tracked already that she was going to be sensitive about time with dad. You might already have tracked that she'd come into the room already activated, so feeling kind of very hyper aroused and very hyper vigilant. You might know that this is a delicate subject for her, and you might understand that the facts that how she reacts isn't even about the issue in the present. It might actually be about something that happened to her, maybe her history with her own dad, maybe about abandonment, maybe about failure or less time with her. And you begin to name the emotion. You begin to say, I can see this matters. Let's just pause for a minute. I can see that this is really distressing for both of you. Um, I can hear that you're describing that he hasn't been present, that he's not going to show up. And given your history, that makes perfect sense. So let's just take a break. And when you're ready, we can come back into this and see if together we can find a solution. It it is it comes with a different energy. And I think that really is our point. And forgive me for oversimplifying a story there. I feel like we all know that there's much more complexities involved in these things. But I think for the sake of our point, it's worth you recognizing that what you see in individuals' behavior isn't necessarily the whole story. And actually, that individual might have had an ace from her family of origin around her father, for example, that would impact how she turns up in that room on that day. Elaine, have you got anything to add on this vignette? Because I know when we talked about this, you had a couple of cases yourself where you were like, this is absolutely a trauma response in the room.
There's one in particular that I can think of just very briefly where I met with the first participant, the husband, who was very charming, and um, he gave his perception of his wife. And when I sent an invitation to the second participant, the response back was absolutely furious. How dare you contact me? Under what authority are you contacting me? It went into quite a lot of detail. Um, I replied in a brief, informative, friendly, and firm way. Biff, for those of you who know Biledi and the High Conflict Institute. And I just said that she had her own choice. She could choose a different mediator if she wanted. She came back to me, still pretty annoyed, but she definitely softened a bit. And we did actually get to meet for an information and assessment meeting. And again, when I first met her, she came across as extremely angry, I think was the main thing, and upset and defensive. But when I was able to speak with her a bit more, it became apparent that she was actually um, the victim survivor of domestic abuse. And this was really a protective response that she had learned, and it was a way of dealing with her own trauma. And that's how it showed up in the room. So, um,
Thank you for sharing that.
yeah. Should we move on to the next slide? Oh,
Yes,
that's great.
now, back to you.
Yeah. Um, so I want to emphasize that this isn't just good practice, it's ethical practice. If you look at the codes of practice for mediators across the UK and globally, the codes emphasize safeguarding, so do no harm, respect, honor and honour the dignity and autonomy of mediation participants. Informed participation, support genuine voluntary agreement. And of course, trauma-informed practice embodies all three of these. So if we mediate without awareness of trauma, we risk re-traumatizing a vulnerable participant, creating acceptable proposals which aren't genuine, it's just compliance born of fear or overwhelm. We also risk breaching our duty of care. Conversely, if we practice trauma-informed mediation, we're safeguarding participants, we're respecting their capacity and needs, and we're supporting authentic proposals. So in my view, it's not a nice to have, it's a professional responsibility. I think we've reached the end of our slides.
Yes, we have, but there was one thing I wanted to throw in at the end there, knowing that there is a gaggle of mediators in the room, and that is about the impact of this work. And I talk quite a lot about vicarious trauma or compassion fatigue. And that's the idea that when we're working with human distress, especially when we're working really in the kind of cold face of it, with families that are in conflict, and we are having to kind of get into the trench with them, then there is a good chance that we will be significantly impacted by the stories. So we call it actually like psychological debris. We kind of get left with the sort of detritus sometimes of our day. Sometimes I know that you'll feel it. You'll come out of a session and you'll be like, gee, where's like, we sometimes describe it as black smoke in therapy. And actually, I think it's very, very important that you prioritize your own self-care. I think it's important that you look after your own pace, you look after your own mental health, you look after your own practice that enables you to downregulate your own nervous system. As much and as helpful as it is for you to lend your nervous system in this process of mediation, when you get it back, it needs a bit of care. And that doesn't just look like a bubble bath. Not that I'm anti-bubble bath, but I think we need to be much, much, much more proactive about thinking about what we need to take care of our mental health. And that might be nature, that might be walking, that could be exercise, it could be meditation, it could be just physical touch with our companions, our children. But I want you to be very, very, very proactive. If you're working on the coalface of human distress and you want to have longevity in your career and you want to stay sensitive and well and not actually become kind of cynical and distant and detached from your work, then we have to be very, very attentive to our own self-care. And I had wanted to make a point about that. But as we come to close, and I think it's going to be good because we're going to have some time for some questions. Let's just run through some of the key takeaways that I hope you'll have garnered from today's session. Okay, so number one, trauma, stroke, threat shapes behavior. And when we understand it, when we can get kind of context and history, when we get insight into an individual's threat responses and how it shows up for them in the here and now, it transforms mediation. It actually means that a client's difficult response, a client's shut down response, a client's inability to make a decision response is connected to their nervous system reaction, is connected to threat, is connected to them actually being activated. And it might mean that we are able to move towards them with less frustration and annoyance and impatience and with more compassion to the kind of crisis that they find themselves in this season of their life. Safety, transparency, and choice are foundational principles. Actually, I think Elaine has really reiterated that. I like the point you make there about it just being just solid ethical practice. In actual fact, I think it's a kind of funny thing to describe you guys as needing to do trauma-informed mediation. I think all mediation should be trauma-informed, and I think we need to do some more work around making sure that is just enmeshed in your practice. Small shifts, point three, small shifts in practice yield measurable improvements. You don't need to become a psychotherapist, although it's a great job for those of you that are interested in kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of people's pasts. But actually, just simple changes to your practice, simple changes to your pace, how you explain things, how you respond emotionally are powerful and can shift the outcome for individuals. As Elena said, trauma-informed mediation is best practice and increasingly expected. I've kind of already said this. And there are lots of resources that are available to you. And I don't know whether this is going to be attached to the presentation, that you'll be able to access this online, but there are lots and lots of opportunities for you to learn more about trauma-informed practice through the team at the Family Mediation Council and, of course, Resolution. Elaine, was there anything you wanted to add as we close before we?
No, I don't think so, Kerry. I've been looking at the questions. I don't think we're going to have time to answer them all. So I'm going to pick one for you, and I'll just read it out. And this
Okay.
is from Charlotte. Thank you very much. She said, I'm meeting with a client from MIAM next week who's asked to bring her mum and sister with her to help support her. I suspect she's definitely suffering trauma. Do you think it's suitable to have these family members in the MIAM to support her? What do you think, Kerry?
Ooh, Elaine, what do you think?
Um, I
I didn't mean to
often,
just
no,
backchat.
I know. I,
But
I will often say to people, I'm here to look after you. I really will be taking care of you. Think carefully about you, whether you do want someone with you. I think possibly two people may be too much because I'd be concerned not to be able to hear the voice of the participant.
Mhm.
And I'd also be worried that they might not be giving me perhaps full answers to my questions because they're worried about the impact it might have on their other family members.
Yeah.
So it is something that where I think it's just on a sort of case by case basis almost. Um, for example, I met with somebody who a blind man, and his mother helped him with everything. So it was absolutely imperative that the mum was there with him. But again, just some gentle questioning, I think, before the MIAM, just to explore the situation, um, and perhaps reducing it down to one supporter might be sufficient. And very often, I think, um, people who are traumatized, they they really do. They have that hypervigilance, don't they, Carrie, about strangers.
Hmm.
And you're a stranger. This person, Charlotte, doesn't know you, doesn't know how nice you are, and how competent and how safe you're going to keep them.
Hmm.
Um, Carrie, what would you add to that?
Yeah,
It's a really good question.
it is a good question. I think case by case, absolutely. But I'm thinking about many, many, many years ago when I did a lot of adolescent therapy support, and I would often have parents say that they wanted to come into the room, and without a shadow of a doubt, the content of the session shifted, and the kind of the vulnerability, the availability of the young person to be able to speak freely was diminished. So what I would often suggest is that they came in and we'd have I'm a big kind of cup of tea kind of girl. We'd have a cup of tea. We'd say hello, we'd settle into the space, and then I would invite them to go and sit, if there was the ability to do that, to kind of sit outside the room. Maybe if you have a kind of waiting area or another meeting room, so that they can be kind of on hand, and that if there's a kind of break in the session, they can go and kind of say hello to mum. But actually, to come back in and be able to have that conversation directly one on one. That way, you're maybe facilitating the safety, but without compromising the ability to hear the voice of the individual. Again, it's a really, really tricky question. Um, I would also, as Elena suggested, be asking the question at the beginning as, what do you think that they would add to you being able to speak freely about what's going on? Because it might be that you can gain some intel from that. Of course, it could be the opposite altogether. It could be that they're being controlled by family members who want to make sure that her point is expressed properly. So sometimes it isn't all that it seems. And maybe your little spidery senses have got a sense of that, which is why you've raised it as a question.
I'm glad we finished with that spidery senses. I really like that.
Yeah. I
We
think it's just spidery senses. Your pattern recognizers, so recognize it. Um,
We've come to the end now of our presentation. Thank you so much to everybody. We've had some great questions. Sorry we couldn't answer them all, but we've really enjoyed being here with you. Paul Carey's got another session to do immediately afterwards, I think. So I'm going to hop onto that. But
an hour.
thank
I've
you
got an
all.
hour.
Yeah, thank you all once again.
Thank-
We really appreciate you listening to what we had to say.
Thanks, guys.